Hey everyone, so last time we went over the draw setups. Here's a helpful diagram for you if you missed it. But today when we talk about playing defense with Melody. So essentially the combo setup requires cash outs, obviously copper, final act, encore, and this is the general equipment that I would run, as well as some helpful cash ins. Now, before we begin, why don't we go over the sequence just once more. So in hand, we want at least one final act, an encore or second final act, as well as possibly a cash in, and then just a blue pitchable. Now, in terms of cash out, we would have already played it and generated the 3 silver off of it by turning in Jinglewood, the Null Rune Gloves, and the Crown of Dominion. So we have 3 silver, 1 gold, and our hand, right? So either final act or encore. Nothing in the arsenal. Again, I'm going to play everything from hand. That way we are playing around arsenal disruption or destruction, which is super useful and obviously a competitive thing. So what would the sequence look like? Well, for starters, what we can do is pop the Spring Blossom, pitch 1 to play our cash in. This draws us 2 cards. So we've drawn neutrally, right? We haven't lost anything just yet. Off of this, we can then start going into our actual sequence. So we can play the gold token, pitch 1, draw 1, and we have 1 resource floating, meaning that we can then play a copper by pitching another one and drawing 1, still drawing neutral. Off that, we can go into our 3 silver, with each of these requiring 1 pitch and drawing 1. So altogether, still neutral. And then we can begin our normal copper sequence. But before we go over that, right, we have done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards. And then we have to pitch 1 more to actually play the final act, or encore, meaning that we have in total pitched 7. And our final act will be hitting for 15. So if we play both final acts right now off of 1 copper, finding cash out and having a cash in our hand, right? Our 2 final acts currently do 30. Whether or not you think 30 is enough to OTK is up to you. But, right, off of 1 copper. Every copper that we now add to the sequence is just going to buff that further. In fact, 1 copper, 1 extra copper is going to buff it the most, because off of 1 copper, we now currently have to pitch 2 and draw 1. So it is a -1 card. We have 2 resources floating, but now our pitch is 8 plus 1, 9, allowing both final acts to now hit for 19 or 38 altogether, right? Off of just 2 copper tokens generated, which can be done in 1 turn if you have a song in hand and use Jinglewood. So you play Jinglewood, you pay 3, right? You get a copper off of it. Your opponent gets a Quicken, Might, or Vigor token. You then play 1 song. This triggers Melody's effect and generates you your 2 copper. You then only have to find cash out and have a cash in hand. And then once again, it's up to you whether or not now you think 38 damage is enough. Otherwise, we can possibly go into 2 more copper off of our draw. We should have 1 in hand off the copper, right? So we have 2 floating still, but we can play 2 more copper and still remain neutral. So off the 2 copper, you have to pitch 1, right? We're floating 2, so that's 5, -4, we're floating 1, we're still floating 1, so we pitch another 3, and that's the other 4. Meaning that our pitch zone is now 11, making each final act hit for 23, or 46 damage off of 4 copper this time, right? So it's whether or not you think 1, 2, or 4 copper is enough to get the job done. Right, let's talk defense. So starting off, we're again mainly stacking the deck with blue pitchables, meaning that you can either go for defensive reactions like unmovable, toughen up, or you can go for just 3 block value blue cards, right? So either of those allows you to play defensively against a physical deck, right? So to speak, but what about Arcane? Well, the easiest thing to do is just to swap out the equipment, right? So Blossom of Spring does help us extend the card sequence a little bit, right? But it's not absolutely necessary, so you could swap to the Null Rune. Same with Jinglewood. Yes, it allows you to generate copper, but you can do so just by playing songs. Again, at the current sequence, right, we're just looking for maybe 2 copper, so 2 turns with Melody playing songs versus an extra Arcane Barrier. And then you also have the Null Rune Hood or the Null Rune Boots. Now in this case, right, I would still keep either the Fleetfoot Sandals or the Crown of Dominion. And the reason for that is either, in the case of the boots, you're now going for 2 final acts over 2 turns, right? Because you have no way to combo them together unless you add in something like Lead the Charge. But then that sort of bogs down the deck because A, it's red. The blue variants don't work for final act. The yellow version does, but I would take it for the duality to be able to use it with final act or the tome. So I'd stick to the red variation, or you could also chuck in something like Captain Skull. But in either scenario, those cards now have to be in the hand, meaning that you have to have final act, second final act, encore, and then one of these cards to generate an action point, meaning that you only have 1 card now to pitch, right? You can make up for that with the gold token, but I would probably keep the Fleetfoot Sandals and run the Null Rune Hood so that you have 4 pieces of Arcane Barrier. So for every time you're pinged, you can pitch up to 4 and block 4 bits of damage. But depending how things line up, there is still a case for taking the Null Rune Boots, right? Because again, cash out is our big play. So you find cash out and you turn in all of your equipment. So at this point, if you take the Null Rune Boots, you're generating 5 silver, right? So you'd cash in the boots, generate 1 silver, the Arcane Lantern 2, the gloves 3, the robes 4, and then the hood for 5. So you now have 5 silver or 5 pitches, because again, silver off of blue is a neutral draw. So what might the play look like currently using this setup? Right, so starting off, what if we went full defense against Arcane? So we've taken the full Null Rune set and the Arcane Lantern, meaning that we have 5 Arcane Barrier, allowing us to pitch 5 to block 5 every time we try and get pinged. Right, so that's pretty defensive, but we don't have the Spring Blossom for the 1 resource. We have the Crown to start with gold, and we don't have the Fleetfoot Sandals to combo 2 Final Acts. So for this scenario, we're going to stipulate that cash out has been found and played, meaning that we have generated silver off of every piece of equipment. So 5 silver in total, but this does mean that you have 1 turn, 1 opening for your opponent to wreck your face, right? Because all our Arcane Barrier is now effectively gone. But that's sort of why I like the combo. It's not a countdown like Runeblade. It's not Insta-Kano. It is something to try to go for, something fun to try and get off. And then in hand, we have 1 Final Act and 3 pitchables, or any combination of these, and cash in, right? Because again, cash in substitutes for copper, meaning you have to generate less copper if you find cash in. But we'll go with 3 blues and our 5 silver. So starting off, the 5 silver, again, is 1-to-1. You pay 3 off of blue pitch. So it's 1 draw to 1 loss. So we can play all 5. And of course, just pitch and draw 5 cards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So already our pitch zone has 5 cards in it, meaning that we are currently hitting for 11 damage. 10 from the pitch zone, and then 1 because Final Act does 1 damage. Right, so in this scenario, we really need to pump Final Act up if we are playing defensive. We can't, again, go for the 2 Final Acts that are smaller damage. So in the scenario, say we have drawn into cash in. We can now play cash in, so we have to pitch 2. We play cash in, and we get 2 cards back, right? So already we've increased our damage by another 4, so 11 becomes 15. And we also have 2 resources floating from the cash in. Okay, so then we can go into our copper sequence, 1 for 1, because of the floating resources. So we played 2 copper, and we've increased it by another 4, so 15 becomes 19. Now, 19 off of 1 Final Act, sadly, is not going to do it, so you will have to have generated a lot more copper with this sequence. You would have either needed to draw into the other cash in, or again, generated more than 2 copper tokens. We can play a total of another 3 copper and cash in, right, off of 2 pitchables. So first copper requires 2 pitchables. We're floating 2 resources, allowing us to play another copper, and then a last copper. We then have 1 pitchable in hand, allowing us to play the Final Act. So we play Final Act and pitch the final card. Our damage is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, right? So we're doing 28 off of here, plus 1. We're doing 29 damage off of having to generate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 copper and finding 1 cash in, or 6 copper, right? So you're looking at, again, 6 to 4 copper, depending on how many cash-ins you find, and finding cash out to play the 5 silver. This is primarily why I wouldn't take either the Null Rune Hood or the Null Rune Boots, right? Either having the Fleetfoot Sandals, which is probably the better one to still run, because you can combo the 2 Final Acts, or having the gold token off the Crown of Dominion. Okay, so this is probably the setup that I would go with, right? We still have the Fleetfoot Sandals to chain 2 Final Acts together, but we're still defensive. We have 4 Arcane Barrier off of 3 Null Rune and 1 Arcane Lantern. We do lose the copper generation of Jinglewood, but still have copper generation through Melody. Again, we're going to stipulate that we play cash out and we cash in all the Arcane Barrier. So 4 pieces of equipment for 4 silver. And then in hand, we want Final Act, or Encore, as well as 2 blue pitchables. You can't have cash in with this starting hand, right? Because you can't play the first cash in. If you had the Blossom of Spring for the 1 extra resource, you could play cash in, but in order to get 4, you'd have to pitch 2 cards, right? So if cash in is one of the cards, then you have to pitch Encore or Final Act, so that just doesn't work. So starting off, we can play the silver like normal. So 4 silver, right, gets us 4 in the pitch zone, and 2 cards back in our hand, because again, it's neutral draw, right? And then we can go into our copper sequence, or just for starters, we're doing 9 damage off of Final Act. Twice is already 18 damage, right? So off of 1 copper now, we pitch 2, draw 1, and we're currently doing 13 damage with each Final Act, or 26 damage in total. Again, if you find cash in, you can substitute it in, just not off of that first copper. So ideally, this is where we'd want to draw into cash in. If either this draw or the next draw was cash in, we could play it instead of copper. But just looking at the normal sequence, you'd be able to play 2 more copper off of the current floating resources, right? So 1, 2, and then we could go into our final act combo. So pitch, final act, encore, or second final act, right? So how much damage are we doing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? So 18 plus 1, 19 damage off of each final act, or 38 damage in total, off of having to generate 3 copper, which without Jinglewood means that we would have had to play 3 songs with melody. Again, does not seem overly difficult, right? Especially if we are just turtling, we're using Arcane Barrier to protect, and we're just playing cards from our hand to block each round. Until we actually get the combo set up, till we find cash out, right? We have the possibility to block for a total of 12, plus whatever defense reaction we might stick into our arsenal. For instance, you might have something like Toughen Up or Fate Foreseen, right? There are plenty of good blue defense reactions or even instants you can use to help mitigate damage. The nice thing too is you can run this as your sideboard, right? So you have either the option of Arcane Barrier, right? Or you could take physical damage equipment. You could take the Crown of Providence or Arcanite Skullcap, right? And then even just say Iron Rot and maybe the Ornate Tensai, right? To cycle cards, or even just Jinglewood, right? So then you have the option, if you're in an arcane damage matchup, to run the Null Rune and Arcane Lantern, or if you're in a more aggressive matchup like Brute or say Guardian, or even Mechanologist, you could take all the physical damage options. Now, what if we go a little bit less defensive, right? So we're back to running the Crown of Dominion for the gold token, Fleetfoot Sandals, but we still have the option of running some defensive equipment in our chest slot, arm slot, and in our weapon slot instead of Jinglewood. Now, in terms of the gold token, while you can use it for cash in, again, to have a positive draw, I personally wouldn't, because that doesn't net you anything in the pitch zone, right? It extends your ability to cash in copper tokens, but it doesn't actually add damage to final act. So I would almost always spend the resources to pop the gold token rather than playing cash in. The only exception would be if you draw cash in your hand, because again, that was one of the issues. If you draw cash in with your combo pieces, so final act, or encore, you stall out. That's also one of the reasons to run the Ornate Tensai, because it would allow you to cycle the cash in and still pitch 1, which then you can make up for with the gold instead of having another copper token. Now, of course, you know what I'm going to say. We found and played the cash out, right? So we have 4 silver cashing in the Crown, the 2 Null Rune, and of course our weapon slot. In hand, we have final act, and of course encore, as well as 2 blue pitchables. Like usual, we can play the silver. So again, 4 for 4. So we'll just do it nice and easy. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because again, we're just mocking up our cards, right? So we currently have 4. So we're doing 9 or 18 damage off of the 2. We can then pop our gold token, paying 1 and floating 1 resource. Then allows us to play 1 copper for a neutral draw, or possibly cash in. And then of course we can go into our normal sequence. We play 1 more copper to pitch 2, right? And this is probably where you'd leave it, so that you only have to generate 2 copper tokens, right? We then play final act into final act encore, so we're pitching 1 more, and we've pitched 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cards, meaning that each final act is doing 19 damage, or 38 in total, again still running some defensive setups. Now, our main objective has just been trying to get this copper down to as low as possible. Again, for each cash in we find, we can swap out a copper, but I think only having to generate 2 copper tokens is pretty doable for Melody, right? Even if we cut it down by 1, and then it just becomes searching for that cash in. So basically, all you need for this deck is cash out, right? To generate silver, I would most likely run 2 copies because it's blue anyway, so it feeds into being pitchable, right? And it's just easier to find it. Then final act. So again, you need 2 copies. Encore, you only need 1 of, right? And it is in contest with that second final act, so you can run both in order to try and find it easier, but I think the 3 is fine, right? So 2 final acts and 1 encore, and then of course cash in you can just throw in as a substitute. 4 copper tokens if you draw into it, it's not an issue, right? There are some situations where it does sort of mess with things. Again, either taking the Ornate Tensai or the Blossom of Spring do help mitigate that, because then you have the 1 extra resource to make cash in a 1 pitchable, or you have the ability to play the Ornate Tensai and cycle it, or have the floating resources from whatever you cycle with the Ornate Tensai to then play cash in. So what does that mean? Well, if you count out the cards, right, that's 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 cards, right? 7 cards are your auto includes in order to make this work. Okay, you then chuck in, say, the 10 songs. You don't have to run all of them. Again, we'd cut down copper immensely, so you could cherry pick the ones you don't think are going to be too advantageous to your opponents. But altogether, that's already 17 cards, right? So less than half your deck is done, and then everything else can just be blue pitchable throwaway cards that you can use to block. So you're either looking for just straight 3 block cards or cards with good effects, right? So defense reactions like Sink Below, Fate Foreseen, Hold the Line, or Unmovable, right? In the case of Sink Below, yes, it is the weakest variant because it's only a 2 block, but it does allow you to cycle a card and, again, fish for those combo pieces, try and find cash out, or final act and then final act or encore, right? Same with Fate Foreseen, allows you to opt, still only block for 2, but it still allows you to opt, and they can be played from the arsenal. They're both free, right? Stick them in the arsenal, and then in most scenarios, you still have the majority of your hand to block with, right? Because your first step is find cash out, right? So you can generally block with 3 cards once you find cash out, and then it's about setting up the combo, which in most cases will allow you to block 3 to 2 cards, right? Once you find 2 pieces, then you have the other 2 cards to block with, or you're just conceding that turn so that you can then play the combo. Now, there are ways to play the combo without having both cards to pitch, right? Leaving you your arsenal and then 1 card to play defensively to help try and get to that combo turn. Hold the Line and Unmovable are both 2 strong defense reactions, right? They do cost, but they have the ability to turn the card you pitched into your additional block, right? Meaning that you don't lose a card to playing it to block with. And then in the case of actual defensive cards, you of course have Warmonger's Diplomacy, right? Currently one of the best defensive or stall cards. This Rounds on Me is also fantastic. It allows you to draw and gives your opponent a -1 to all their attacks, right? That is pretty huge because, again, it still sets you up to block. It helps you fish. And technically, I mean, you can just throw it into the combo, right? It is a -1, so it does replace copper, but it can still be useful to add that draw element and to extend the pitch. And then you have Peace of Mind. Peace of Mind allows you to prevent 2 damage from the next damage source. It's an instant, so you play it on your opponent's turn, but you also create a Ponder token. Again, allowing you to refill your hand and make sure you get a card into your arsenal so that you are ready to block on your opponent's turn. So, in combination with, again, those 23 cards that you can just designate to being defensive cards, as well as the ability to swap in Null Ruined Gear. Again, if you want to play super defensively, you can take the full set, right? It's going to be a little bit hard to get your combo off, so I'd most likely keep the Fleetfoot Sandals and just run 3 pieces plus the Arcane Lantern, but there are still great, viable defensive options for Melody, and of course you can run other color cards, right? It just does muddle things up a little bit once you actually get the combo going. But if you can play into them before you get the combo, so like sticking a tome in your arsenal, or even going for some more aggressive cards like Command and Conquer, or Enlightened Strike, or anything else that usually gets played, is still fine, right? Because again, in terms of pitch, we're looking at, you know, possibly around 10 cards. Is the general gist, right? So 10 of your cards have to be blue. Again, if you're just stalling out till you know for certain that you're always going to pitch blue, or you're just running full blues in your deck, minus, of course, the combo cards. So I do think there are plenty of options for Melody to be played defensively. And again, the big thing is, right, this is all planning without seeing the majority of her cards. We haven't actually seen what's included in the box, right? So we don't know if there's better ways to search and find or even generate copper. So there's only one way to go from here, and that's up, right? So again, Melody will be viable. To what extent, right? That's the argument now. It's not, you know, whether or not you think you can generate copper. Because again, we have cut out the majority of copper. Most of the time, using these setups, you're just looking to generate 2 copper, which can be done on turn 1 with Jinglewood and a song, or 2 turns just through playing songs with Melody. Again, they're 1/4 your deck, so drawing into them isn't that difficult. And altogether, right? Melody is playable. Right, so here's the defensive variation that I would run. So Arcane Barrier, Null Ruin, Null Ruin, Null Ruin. Again, if you're in the Arcane matchup, can also run the Arcanite Skullcap, but I do like making the deck sort of budget friendly. So this is the big cost, same with Crown of Providence. Basically, again, combo pieces. So Final Act, Cash In, Encore, and Cash Out. Now, I always run the Golgarian Tome if I'm running any sort of combo deck, because it is just a -1 to your deck, right? So that's pretty huge. And then, of course, again, just defensive cards and songs. So Fate Foreseen as a defensive reaction, allows you to opt, hold the line. Humble is an attack that allows you to pressure, right? Because it has a pretty strong effect. So generally, your opponent will want to block it. You can also run Farendel's Fighting Spirit, right? But you would run the blue, so it's the least damage, but it's still 5. And still gives you the opportunity to heal a little bit. I think just taking the defensive options and stalling. So it's Rounds on Me, -1, Warmongers, and then Whispers of the Oracle, block for 3 or opt for 2. Toughen Up, mainly defense reaction, so you have the ability to stick them in the arsenal and play more cards. Sift, just to search, and then even like Rally the Rearguard, right? So that you can proc its instant, just a buff if your opponent, you know, chucks out something like a pummel, right? So yeah, altogether, I think there are viable options to play defensively. Again, you don't have to go with the super expensive cards. I would probably run the Arcanite, because Arcanite's not that expensive either, right? And it's pretty flexible. Allows you to sideboard some other stuff too, right? Instead of running the Null Rune, and you will generally have less HP because again, you are turtling. And then Crown of Providence is probably just a good deck tech, right? If you know you're in a non-arcane damage matchup, right? Just to have, again, the search potential to help you find your combo pieces. Like usual, the link to this version of the deck will be in the description. Hope you enjoyed.